you quite understandably may not know very much about this author. And so I'm going to just start out by setting some very basic parameters for understanding him. He was born in 1778 and he died in 1830. And if you take those two dates and think about them in terms of their historical context, there are two things I think that immediately become pertinent. One is a phenomenon called Romanticism that happened in Europe during this period, notably in Germany and in Britain. It occurred a bit later in France, and we can perhaps think about some of the features of Romanticism a bit later on. I don't want to go into what Romanticism is because I don't think it's a single entity in that way. But it's worth bearing in mind in terms of perhaps better known or more familiar figures that he was a little bit younger than Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth was born in 1770, Coleridge was born in 1772, and Hazlitt actually met with Wordsworth and Coleridge when he was about 20 in 1798. And if you want an essay that registers the impact of the new kind of poetry that Hazlitt thought Wordsworth and Coleridge were writing, then I recommend an essay to you called On My First Acquaintance with Poets. It's probably one of the, he doesn't use the word romanticism in it, but it's a very interesting early formulation of what Hazlitt describes as a new spirit in poetry. So he was alert to the fact that the notion of literature itself was being reinvented, reimagined during the period of his own lifetime. And in relationship to a later generation of romantics, Keats and Shelley, whom he knew as well and wrote about as well, he was a little bit older than they were. He was of a slightly older generation. So he's an interesting figure generationally. He's sort of between the first generation romantic poets and the second generation romantic poets, and he's responding in his own lifetime to their work in different ways. And if we get onto it in later in our discussion, we'll see that he takes on, and I mean takes on, in On Living to Oneself, one of the most famous romantic poets of his time, and that is Byron. There's a tussle he has with Byron towards the end of the essay. He had very mixed feelings about Byron. He was suspicious of his aristocratic standing, but at the same time admired his politics, his advocacy in the cause of liberty, Byron's stance towards Greek independence, for example. So he's interestingly poised in terms of what we understand by romanticism. And of course, the second context that is immediately evoked by his lifetime, the dates, the beginning and end of his life, is the French Revolution. And the French Revolution had a profound impact upon Hazlitt. He was an active supporter of the French Revolution. He was committed to its fundamental values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, as it was formulated in that period. And unusually, and in a way that provoked a good deal of hostility amongst some of his peers, he thought that Napoleon Bonaparte was a continuation of the French Revolution, not a betrayal of it. And therefore, at a time when Britain was at war with France and at war with Napoleon, he supported the Napoleonic cause. And that will begin to give you another kind of sense of him, which is that he was a bit of an outsider. He was a bit, he didn't feel at home in elite British literary culture, I think, at all. And you can see this in some of the ways in which he's described. The word strange often occurs when people try to describe him physically. Coleridge memorably described him as shoe contemplative, brow hanging, strange. What he meant by that was that when Hazlitt came into a room, he would often look down. He wouldn't engage with people. He was a little bit shy, awkward, self-conscious when he was around them. Not when he felt he was amongst friends, though. Um, the so one of the reasons that Hazlitt welcomed the French Revolution was because he saw it as continuous with the values that he had inherited from his father and from the religion that his father espoused, which was Unitarianism. Now, I don't want to go into the theology of Unitarianism now. It's not particularly relevant. What in terms of thinking about Hazlitt and how he's situated in English literary culture, it's worth bearing in mind that Unitarianism, amongst other things, is one of the forms of dissenting religion in Britain. That's to say, Hazlitt was never associated with the Anglican establishment, with the established church. In fact, he was an opponent of the established church. Unitarianism was a very interesting religion. As its title implies, it didn't believe in the Trinity. It didn't believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost in Christian terms. So it didn't believe in the Anglican Creed. Christ was thought of as being a human being. He was thought of as being an exceptional human being whose moral teachings were inspired by God, but he wasn't regarded as being part of the divine. And another very important feature of Unitarianism was its embrace of rationality, of 18th century Enlightenment reason. It set a very high value on rational inquiry, on conversation, on debate, on the productive character of disagreement. And this was a culture that Hazlitt would have grown up in. His father was a leading figure in the development of Unitarianism, both in Britain, well, especially in the United States. He was one of the people who helped found Unitarianism in the United States. And one of the consequences of that was that at a very early age, Hazlitt himself, as a young boy, scarcely more than an infant, lived for a number of months in the US before coming back to Britain. So he'd been out to the Americas and then came back again. But the other thing to bear in mind about Unitarianism was, of course, that if you were a Unitarian, you were debarred from entry into the main centres of learning at that time. Oxford and Cambridge were not permitted. And so one of the things that the Unitarians and other dissenting religions did was they set up this incredible network of educational institutions and academies. And Hazlitt was educated at one of these. It was called the New Unitarian College at Hackney. He went there when he was 15. And the curriculum at the New Unitarian College at Hackney was extremely progressive by the standards of the day. So Hazlitt would have been reading the rationalist philosophers there. He would have been reading Hobbes. He would have been reading Locke, and so on and so forth. And he imbibed a philosophical education. And one of his earliest published books, published in 1805, was a work of philosophy. It was called An Essay on Human Action, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other thing about the Unitarian College at the time that Hazlitt went there was that it was regarded by political and cultural conservatives living in London, because it was in London, as a little bit like it was regarded as a sort of hotbed of revolutionary thought and indeed of atheism. And one of the things that happened while Hazlitt was there was that he indeed lost any Christian faith that he had had. And when he left Unitarianism, he did not follow in his father's footsteps to become a minister. He broke from that expectation, and he tried to earn a living briefly as a painter, fetched up in London, and began over time to begin to earn a living as a freelance lecturer and as crucially a journalist. It's very important in thinking about Hazlitt to bear in mind that he wrote for money. He wrote in order to earn a living. In that respect, he was not like Byron, who regarded it as beneath himself to earn money from his book sales, because it was not appropriate for an aristocrat to do so. It was demeaning for an aristocrat to earn money in that way. But nor did he take on, as both Wordsworth and Coleridge did in their different ways as they grew up, he didn't take on a patron. He wasn't ever supported by a patron. So he was, in that sense, I think, both, well, he had a kind of independence. He didn't write to please a patron. He didn't have aristocratic standing, so he didn't have the sort of social confidence of figures like Byron and Shelley. And he was a person who was accustomed to writing to deadlines. And he was developing and writing in journalistic forms in London, which was one of the, if you think of the literary culture of Britain during this time, there were two great sort of centres. One was in Edinburgh, one was in London. Edinburgh's got London, obviously in the UK, in England, and Hazlitt was writing for journals in both of these. And he wrote very widely about a range of subjects. He wrote drama reviews. He was out and about in London, going to the theatre, going to picture galleries. So you have to imagine him as being very much a kind of urban journalist, with the sensibility of an urban journalist, quick to pick up on what was the new, but at the same time possessed of this reflective philosophical intelligence, which he was endlessly bringing to bear on the materials of his own experience. He also wrote political essays during this period. We're now thinking of the 1810s into the 1820s. And this made him, along with his sexual life, into a very controversial figure. He was attacked repeatedly by the conservative press of his time, because he had become, by the late 18-teens, around 1819, 1820, he had become a prominent figure. He was hailed as being, for the quality of his critical mind and so on and so forth, but at the same time he was an intensely controversial figure. He was attacked for his vulgarity, for not being a gentleman, for his the person who wrote about Keats and called Keats a Cockney and talked about Cockney style, included Hazlitt as being a Cockney, and a Cockney in that use was a pejorative word for an urban Londoner who didn't know how to behave, who didn't know what appropriate literary style was, and so on and so forth. So Hazlitt was, you have to imagine somebody who would be accustomed to being subject to vitriolic attack. And if you take time to look into them, if you want to, you'll see how vitriolic they were. Very personalized attacks. He would read these or hear about them every week. It would be happening in this intensely agitated, politically divided world of journalism in London in the 1890s and the early 1820s. He published in book form as well. Those books might often take the form of collections of reviews and essays, as in the 1819 collection of political essays. His Characters of Shakespeare's Plays, also published around that time. And he was a great advocate of Shakespeare. He regarded Shakespeare as being the great universal genius. He published a collection that drew on his experience of seeing Shakespeare performed. He then began to write essays which were published, some of them originally in book form for the first time. Table Talk, his 1821 collection, is an example of this, and On Living to Oneself is in that collection, Table Talk. And some people thought that what is happening during this period is that his essays were becoming more personal. They were becoming more autobiographical than they had been before. And so he was seen as being somebody who was beginning to turn the essay form into something different to what it had been before. And in this, the person he was most frequently compared to, and who was a good friend of his, was Charles Lamb. So You can think of Lamb and Hazlitt as these two, let's call them romantic essayists, sitting alongside the romantic poets, sitting alongside the novelists of the period, uh, like Mary Wollstonecraft, the political theorist, but also her daughter Mary Shelley and the publisher of Frankenstein. The author of Frankenstein. This is the where you see Hazlitt beginning to fit into a configuration of romantic genres. He published in 1823 a book called Liber Amoris, which was an odd. I've written about it quite a lot. It's a book which offers to document an obsessional love affair that he entered into with the daughter of a lodging house keeper in Holborn, where Hazlitt lived for a number of years, from 1819 to about 1822. It was published with a pretense of fictional anonymity, but it was immediately seen through, and this led to an intensification of the attacks on Hazlitt, to such a this was regarded as an obscene book, an improper book, that he lost his London publishers for a while, and the next city he was published in was Paris in 1825. And during this period, the last 5 years or so of his life, he travelled quite extensively in France and in Italy. He lived in Paris and in London and in a place called Winterslow, where he went to write, and devoted himself to writing a 3-volume Life of Napoleon. He died in poverty in 1830 in a room in Soho. One of the last things he wrote was a letter to the editor of the Edinburgh Review, Francis Jeffrey, asking him if he could loan him some money. He had been arrested for debt earlier in his life. He lived on the edge, Hazlitt. He wasn't what you would describe as a person who lived a kind of ordinary middle-class existence. He was much more volatile, more mobile than that. So that gives you a few thoughts on his biography and on the historical resonances of his biography. Let me just say something about his critical reputation, and then we might begin to move into the essay. As I've suggested, in his own lifetime, he was both respected and reviled. I think quite a lot of the admiration for him was based with you can't divorce admiration and rejection here, or revulsion, from politics. Those people who were sympathetic to Hazlitt's politics were sympathetic to his critical positions, admired him as a stylist. Those people who were not didn't. So in his own lifetime, I think politics plays a very important part in how he was regarded, because he was regarded as being he was a Republican, by the way. I forgot to mention that. He didn't support the institution of the monarchy. And if you want to read a very, very good critique of what underlies monarchy, the social psychology of monarchy, he wrote a very good essay called On the Spirit of Monarchy, which captures very precisely the patterns of identification between subject and ruler that enter into the spirit, as he calls it, of monarchy. In the 19th century, I think he has a subterranean influence, which is only now beginning to be acknowledged. He certainly influenced some of the major writers of the 19th century. Dickens would be one of them. Ruskin would be another. And Robert Louis Stevenson, later in the century, was a great admirer of Hazlitt's and a public admirer of Hazlitt's. But he didn't have he was on the margins of reputation, I think, through the 19th century. He didn't have the same sort of standing as a figure like Wordsworth. But he was interesting because he was influential, but he was influential in an almost anonymous sense. I think George Eliot responded to his work, for example, as well as Dickens. And then into the 20th century, well, there were critical editions made of his work in the late 19th century. Then in the the early 1930s, there was the first edition that approached to scholarly standards, I think, and that was edited by a person called Percy Howe. 21 volumes of Hazlitt's collected writings in very small print, as I discovered to my cost when I started to use them extensively. Um, and but in terms of the academic study of literature, the university study of literature, Hazlitt had very little place or purchase. I think this was partly to do with the way in which Romanticism was thought about in the 1960s and the 1970s. That's to say, it was predominantly thought about as being to do with poets, the canonical poets, and not to do with essayists. Um, and I think it was also to do with the temperamental conservatism of a great deal of of literary criticism of that period. Um, but that picture began to change in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, when you begin to get the first big academic studies of Hazlitt's work. I think notably of a book by the American David Bromwich called Hazlitt, The Mind of a Critic, published in 1983, I think. And then a little later in that decade, Tom Paulin's book called The Day Star of Liberty. Now, Hazlitt is very widely, much more widely studied in academic life, much more widely read. There is a journal of Hazlitt studies which is devoted to his work. There is a steady stream of books and articles about him. And I think, too, his reputation has grown, at least in Britain and in the United States. I don't know how people regard him in India, but his reputation has grown as a result of an increasing interest and an increasing value attached to the form of the essay itself. There's a kind of fascination now, a greater fascination with the essay than there was, let's say, 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. And the thought that the essay is a genre worth taking seriously in its own right is, I think, one that is provoked by reading Hazlitt. You know, what do we mean by an essay? What are the distinctive virtues of an essay? What's happening in an essay? Why should they be worth reading? Those are all, it seems to me, questions we might want to bear in mind when we approach On Living to Oneself. I think there are just two things I'd want to say before we turn to the essay. Hazlitt himself was very conscious of questions of style and language. And this is putting it very, very roughly and very crudely, but I think helpfully. There were two models of language that Hazlitt espoused. One was the one he called familiar style, and he wrote an essay called On Familiar Style. And the model of familiar style for him was conversation. He was part of that great movement in the 18th century, which continues into the 19th century, which persistently thought of literature and writing on the model of conversation. It was a way of engaging with an interlocutor. It was a way of, and it involved, you know, a sense of what a good style was. A good style should be comprehensible. It shouldn't be jargon laden. It shouldn't use a lot of specialized terms. It should, the phrase that Hazlitt used was, it should be like common conversation, right? Common conversation. What he means by common there is as accessible to as many people as possible. That's one of the things he means by common. But the other thing it means, of course, is that you shape a literary style not in relationship to classical precedent, say the model of, I don't know, Homer or whoever it might be, or indeed necessarily to the model of a tradition. You shape your style according to your sense of the way in which people talk. And style becomes a distillation of a way of talking, of what you hear when people speak. It's a very interesting idea. It has its own problems, of course. I don't want to go into those now, but that's one of his models. The other model of language, of excellent language for him, is something that he writes about in the opening lecture of his 1819 series on English poetry. And it's what he calls emphatical language. Okay, emphatical language. And by emphatical language, he means really speech that is passionate, that is in the grip of feeling, okay? And for him, and this is very interesting in relationship to the way in which Romantic poets or Romanticism thinks about poetry, for him, that was poetry. Poetry was language in the grip of passion, emphatical language. He makes it very clear in that lecture that he doesn't think of poetry as a genre, a literary genre. He makes a rather snide comment about people who go around looking for 10-syllable lines. That's not poetry. He says, no, poetry is actually a way of experiencing the world. And this idea, of course, is one that is central to Romanticism. And it's one to which Hazlitt gives articulation. Poetry is not a literary genre, it's a mode of experience. And in fact, Hazlitt, it's that mode of experience which arises when we are feeling passionately. Because for that, that for Hazlitt was also synonymous with our inventing, imagining intensively as well. There was a close relationship between the two. And he memorably described in that he thought of man as a poetical animal, he called him. He meant, and that's a sexist, obviously, in a sense, to our ears, sexist use of the term man. I think he didn't mean just men, he meant man as human beings in general. That's to say, we were people who were endlessly imagining the world that we live in and creating fictions about that world, which were either confirmed or rudely destroyed by experience. But he was very, very alert to this dimension in the way in which he thought about experience in what I would call his philosophy of experience. And it was for this reason, which takes me back to the remark I made about the early philosophical work. It was for this reason that Hazlitt opposed and thought incorrect, untrue, all egotistical theories of human motivation. He did not think that the primary cause of our actions was selfishness. He thought that we were endlessly being carried out of ourselves by our experiences, not being, as it were, bound up in instrumental calculation about our self-interest. He thought that you could think in that way. He didn't dispute that. He didn't dispute the fact of self-interested thinking. What he did dispute was that self-interested thinking was a basic reason why we acted as we did. And that's his if there's one thing that you find recurring in his work, it's his distrust of and his critique of selfishness, and his recoil from what he saw as the forms that selfishness was taking in the culture around him. Okay, so anything you wanted to go back over there or pause on? Perhaps it's time to go into the essay now, do you think? Yeah. Okay. Well, just this on living to oneself was written. We have a fairly precise. By the way, apropos of scholarship, very few of Hazlitt's manuscripts survive. So any person trying to edit his work